I'm dealing with Turkey since many years, at least since I joined the European Parliament in 1996, which is now 18 years. I'm informing myself from different sources, and not, as the Prime Minister recently said, only from one source. Because to have a relatively objective picture, whatever that is, you have to have different resources. And I know that if I criticize the government, CHP and others are jubileeing and happy. If I criticize CHP, the government is mentioning me. So that's what shows how antagonistic the political climate in this country is. There was a discussion before over the question of trust, to trust each other. Well, we are far away from trusting each other in Turkey. On the contrary, we are distrusting us, or the different political forces distrusting us very much. But of course, in addition to the opposition between government and opposition, now came the Gülen movement as one of the elements which is maybe dividing society, or at least being used by the government to accuse the undermining of the state. Nevertheless, before going into the detail of Turkey, let me go on to another date, far away. Because we have that meeting here in Istanbul several weeks before we can and should and must commemorate the start of the First World War. Why do I mention the First World War? Not only because it destroyed two important empires, the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman Empire, but it was also a focal point for the fight between different political forces, the more nationalistic forces and still the more cosmopolitan or supranational forces in all the countries. And the nationalism who was winning for a time was showing its double face. On the one hand, the progressive face of building up new nations. If you think about the Kemal Atatürk's revolution in Turkey, in despising the multicultural, multifaceted Ottoman Empire. On the other hand, of course, it was not always open to all the citizens. In Turkey, when you think about the Kurdish question, but in many other countries, it was the same. Either you are on the one side, on the right, nationalistic side, or you're on the wrong side. Still today, we have a lot of discussions. For example, and I was some days ago in Ukraine, you have the same discussion, what nationalistic means. And some young Maidan, guy from the Maidan movement in Kharkov in the East Ukraine came to me and said, you should not mix nationalism with right-wing extremism. Some people do, and some people are both. But there is also that progressive nationalism. And I think it's very, very important also for Turkey, for those who just belong more or less to the nationalist forces, to have it as a progressive force, open-minded force, building a new society, an open democratic society, and not excluding anybody from that kind of society. But of course, after the First World War, we saw a time where in many countries in Europe, the aftermath of the First World War was not well digested. New authoritarian forces appeared with fascism and, of course, the Nazi system in Germany and that specifically. So the Second World War broke out, and only then, after this horrific Second World War with the Holocaust, European countries started to move away from a separation and division and divided Europe and antagonistic Europe into building up a new Europe, finally also in the European Union. This was a long way, and therefore I mentioned the 100 years ago start of the First World War. Of course, the many tendencies have been before. First World War was the focal point of a long strife, a long fight for democracy and unity. And what is true for the European Union, of course, is true for many different countries. I came here from Bucharest, from Romania, where I had a 3-day visit there, and also shown that even there, with minorities, Hungarian minorities and other minorities, and the political system with all the aftermath of the former communist system, you are still struggling. So also as the Consul General of the United States of America said in the morning, it's always a struggle. Things are not self-evident. You have to fight for it. And therefore, I think a lively debate and a lively fight is absolutely important. So we found the European Union, which again is not ready yet or finished. We are in building up a new house with all the deficiencies. If you build a new house for a long time and you get new people in, then the new people say, well, but I have something I want to change and want to have a separate room there and another kind of roof there. So this is the difficulty if you build a house with different parties joining only after you have started the house. European Union is an economic union, yes, and especially with the euro, we try to be a strong economic union with all the difficulties we have for the moment. It's a political union, again, not yet political enough in the sense of a strong common foreign policy, although we made a lot of progress. But it's also a union of the rule of law. And that is very often forgotten. That the European Union is based on the rule of law, with violations inside the European Union and violations also in future member states. And therefore it is absolutely has to be rejected. If some government representatives in Turkey or in other countries where we had negotiations say, what do you interfere in our business? Once you start accession negotiation, your business is our business and our business is your business. And we cannot separate that because, again, especially the rule of law. In the contrary, because of the experience we had in the past, European Union decided that in future accession talks, the so-called chapter 23 and 24, the chapters which are dealing with judiciary and fundamental rights and with justice, freedom and security, should be at the beginning of negotiations and not at the end as it was. I was, for all the time from the beginning of negotiations towards the end, rapporteur of the European Parliament for Croatia. And I said also very clear to them, the fight against corruption, the rule of law, the change and the reform of the judiciary system are in the core of our talks, even if they are at the end. At that time, it was still at the end. And you can be happy if we discuss it with you during negotiations, because once you are a member, it is very difficult that you do the necessary reform. But I will come to that in a minute. But now the European Union said we want to change. But I think it's a bit hypocritical and contradictory that the European Union is not opening the chapters 23 and 24 with Turkey. Because that is what it's about, and what also the debate today was about and will be about. How strongly the government is dedicated to fulfill the conditions of the chapter 23-24, again, 23, judiciary and fundamental rights, and 24, justice, freedom, and security, internal security. These are the issues we have to discuss with Turkey. This is an issue where we have also some criticism against Turkey or Turkish government, not against the country, but against the government. But as long as the European Union is not opening the two chapters, it's a bit strange that we discuss with the government or criticize the government, but we don't open the chapter where we can honestly not only discuss, but put pressure on the implementation of the details in the judiciary and all the elements of the fundamental rights. May I just mention three elements where we have very critical comments. The one, of course, is the independence of the media. Somebody else will come and speak about it, and the freedom of expressions. Already was mentioned. The attempt of the government to exclude or to close access to YouTube or Twitter are only two examples where we as European Union say this is not acceptable. Why should younger people not have the possibility to have this access and to use YouTube and Twitter, even if there are demonstrations like there were at the Gezi Park? Also demonstrations, if peacefully, are part of democracy. So you cannot cut information and media of information in order to prevent democratic right of demonstrations. There are, of course, always possibility to misuse legal instruments. Then you make laws against the misuse. It's not easy, I know. We had a long discussion also in European Union, European Parliament. But I think our conclusion is the more open you leave the possibility of citizens to use these instruments, the less they will be misused for bad purposes. But anyway, of course, any government, any parliament is open to fight against this misuse. Secondly, of course, and in connection with that, individual freedoms. We see that some of the individual freedoms are impeded. If I see, for example, that the new MIT, which is not the American MIT, has been created in the country where you can go even to lawyers' offices without court decision and ask for the files and ask for the computers to get all the information a lawyer needs for defending, for example, somebody. This is not acceptable. This is not in compliance with the basic rights of citizens and, of course, of the profession of lawyers. And therefore, I think we really have to think very sincerely how we can bring the government back to the legal position. I understand it's not acceptable on the other way, or on the other hand, that private telephone contacts and communications are taped and are publicized. I'm not defending that, not at all. Even if we get some interesting information about corruption, whatever, but it's not the business of media or the public to look into it. Again, it must be courts who decide on these instruments of information and should be used very restrictive. But it's not possible that the government says, because of I have been taped and my communication has been made public, now I create an instrument to do, if I want to do the same, and to violate basic human rights. Thirdly, of course, the justice system. Something has been said, and more will be said in this debate. I'm very concerned that some of the reforms the Erdogan government did, where I defended it on behalf of the European Parliament, what they did, and again offended the opposition who was against, that now we have the situation that the government wants to go back to the old system, and the opposition says, no, we have to stay to the system. The opposition wants a system they rejected 2 years ago, and the government wants a system they changed 2 years ago, which is a strange situation and shows again the lack of trust and I think the lack of a strong-term vision. I must confess, of course, when speaking here and criticizing the situation in the political situation in Turkey, that I'm at the same time criticizing the system in some European member countries. It is not that when we criticize outside countries with whom we have accession talks, that I say everything is good as in the European Union member countries. No, not at all. Not at all. We've created inside the European Union the so-called Article 7 of the treaty, which again says we have to do something against if member countries violate European values. We are already knowing that the instruments we have for dealing with violations inside the EU are insufficient. And you know, for example, the case of Hungary, where again and again the European Commission asked for Hungary to change their laws, and even went to the European Court, or Hungary went to the European Court. To mention one element, because that is also very relevant for the discussion in Turkey. When the Orban government decided an early retirement scheme for judges, which could be called a very social system. You know, you give the possibility of judges for early retirement, but it was not only the possibility, it was the enforcement of early retirement. The Commission protested, and the European Court confirmed that this is violation. Because even by an early retirement scheme, you can change the orientation of the courts and nominate new judges which are more favorable to the government than was before. So also inside the European Union, and that is also my message to the Prime Minister and to the representatives of the government, also inside the European Union, we are very critical with some of the developments. And as, again, we are in accession talk, when it talks about future membership of Turkey, we also have to be open and clear on concerning Turkey. Now, let me come more or less to the conclusion. We, of course, have to accept, and we accept the results of the elections in Turkey. There's no doubt about it. It's up to the Turkish people to vote for their government. But to have been voted into the government, you are not free totally whatever you want. Some governments like to do it, like sometimes have the impression in Turkey, sometimes have the impression in Hungary or in other countries. And if there are two basic accusations, mutual accusations in Turkey, we need, of course, clarification, objective clarification. The one is the accusation on corruption. I think somebody from the Council of Europe will speak about that. It's a very important subject, not only in Turkey, in many of our member countries. Corruption is a big issue, has been under the carpet for all too long time. But we have to make it clear what is now with the corruption, where are the corruption cases, how are they followed, how are they scrutinized. And the other, of course, is the government's declaration that the Gülen movement is undermining and changing and infiltrating the whole judiciary and police system. Again, we need proofs, we need clarification. Also clarification, when did that happen, and how did that happen? How was it possible for a government and Mr. Erdogan to have that infiltration, and all of a sudden he noticed the infiltration? Did he open the judiciary for that infiltration, but then was overtaken because they were critical towards him or whatever? So I think we need clarification. Because to have always these kind of discussion, and you don't need an extradition of Mr. Gülen from the United States to Turkey, because it's not only about him, because the accusation is against many people in Turkey itself that they did it, but I think we need a very clear clarification. With an independent justice and judiciary, and if that is not available in Turkey, according to the Prime Minister, then of course international experts can come and help, as they are here today, and I think it's a very good idea to have that kind of discussion and invitation. Let me end by saying the European Union needs Turkey for many, many issues we have to discuss. The European Union needs Turkey for the solution of the Cyprus issue, for improving the situation with Armenia, for the Middle East, for the Kurdish issue, where Prime Minister Erdogan is doing good initiative, and finally also for the big crisis in Ukraine. The Prime Minister is doing a lot of positive steps in that direction. Why does he step back in another direction? This is a question with which I want to end without giving an answer. Some people have their orientation, but let me make it clear again. The criticism of Turkish government position is not one of animosity or because we are against Turkey, not at all. Because we need a democratic Turkey as a strong alliance of European Union and in future member of European Union. That is what we need from Turkey, and we'll be hopeful that this conference and this discussion and discussions like this will help to have that democratic Turkey, and that we in Europe do our job in opening up our doors for Turkey, opening up new chapters of negotiations, because Turkey is too much important to put it aside. No, we need a democratic Turkey in the midst of the European Union. Thank you very much for your attention.